Okay, I hit the recording button and okay, here we go. So good morning, everybody. Welcome you to webinar 2 for our EPA revitalization project with GDIT. Why don't we go around the room and do introductions? Dale Krupp with Vita Nova. Just introducing folks today and the program we have for you. Why don't we start with the town? Rosemary.
Sure.
Oh,
Rosemary, go ahead.
I'm Rosemary Olson. I'm the Executive Director of the Town of North Hempstead Community Development Agency.
Joe Santamaria, North Hempstead Community Development, Assistant Executive Director.
And Neil Stone, working with the EPA on the assessment grants, community planner with the Town of North Hempstead Planning Department.
Okay, EPA. Ann?
Hi. Go ahead, Sam.
Oh, Sam?
Nope.
Dick.
Okay.
Jen.
Hi, everyone. This is Sam Siegel. I'm also here at EPA headquarters, sitting in with Ann.
And Carol, also with EPA headquarters. Hi, all.
Jenny Cholisos, Brownfields Project Manager, Region 2.
Okay, I think we have everybody there. And then we have GDIT.
Hi, I'm Matt Plackey with GDIT. I'm part of the contracting team. Vita Nova is doing a lot of the heavy lifting on this, but I'm around for project management support and anything else needed. So thanks. Good to be here.
And the Vita Nova team.
I can
Hi.
start.
Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Jim Rocco with Vita Nova. I've been working on the prioritization project, which you'll be hearing from me a little bit later. And also we'll be working with Juliet on the reuse assessment.
And I'm Juliet, and thank you to the town for providing the data and reviewing the worksheet that we'll be discussing today. And then you'll hear from me at the end about what we can expect in the next task, which will be pulling all this data together and making some sense of it for a priority site. So good morning, everyone, or afternoon at this point.
And I'm Elaine Richardson with Vita Nova. I did the market analysis for this project, but today my role is going to be talk to you a little bit about some of the resources that EPA has to help you not only on this site, but on other sites as you look at the other properties in your prioritization list.
Okay, I believe we got everybody. Again, our scope was to work with the town to do market analysis, of course, and do a good inventory of the sites that they have not really developed a strategy for. And then, the original one was 13 selected sites. I think we're up to 15 now, and the sites include 25 plus parcels, and to eventually do a reuse.
I think we have some issues here.
What's that?
We're hearing him, Jim.
Jim.
Keep going, Dale. I'll make sure
he text them. Right. So, what we've already delivered is the market assessment that Elaine did. I've been doing stakeholder interviews right along, and I will continue to do them till the end of the project. I just did one the other day. I've talked to artists, recreation people, business people. I've talked to people in healthcare. And so it's been really helpful to help think about how these parcels are going to be used ultimately, not just the top one, but all of them. And the reuse assessment itself will be done at the next webinar with Juliet and Jim, and then we'll finish our final report by February. So today, we're going to just, we're updating you on what we're doing. Elaine's going to really get into the Ready Guide. Jim's going to talk about the prioritization process, and under remaining tasks and schedule, Juliet's going to give you a preview with a couple slides of what's going to come next, and so you'll understand how it all fits together, and pick your brain a little bit about some of the sites that we think are the top sites based on Jim's analysis. So we've pretty much are on target. We had our first webinar in October, and we've been doing stakeholder interviews, and we continue to always improve mapping and the site prioritization, just like
Eric,
we-
it looks like you and I are the only ones on the call. I just had a note from Patrick that said he was trying to get on, but nobody was here, and I don't know.
Does everybody hear me?
Jim?
Yes.
Why don't you text him
Yes.
separately?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay.
I just muted Jim, so you can continue, Dale, and we'll figure out
Okay.
what's going on, okay?
Okay. So again, today we're going to do this inventory and the Ready Guide overview. And again, just to quickly talk about the stakeholder interviews I've done, I've talked to everybody, and I think, just from a community needs, you have obviously tax-based and economic development needs, but you also have all kinds of other needs related to wraparound services. And these conversations will continue through time. So here I'm going to turn it over to Elaine. Elaine will take it from here. Elaine, just tell me when to go to the next slide. Elaine?
Sorry about that. I was talking to Jim to make sure he was all set.
Okay.
Okay. EPA has the Revitalization Ready Guide, and that's a guide that helps communities go through the process of preparing sites for redevelopment. And it's essentially the process that we go through on every single property that we're involved with. And the reason that we're talking about this today is I'm going to go through the guide fairly simply and introduce you to the resources that are available so that when we're gone and we're done this work, and we've done the reuse assessment on the priority property or properties, you can continue on and follow this process that EPA recommends on the other sites, the other brownfield sites that are not one of your priorities. Obviously, you want to get these all done over time. So to understand what the Revitalization Ready Guide is, it's designed to help communities revitalize and redevelop and reuse potentially contaminated, you don't always know yet if it's contaminated, idle or underutilized properties. And it is a guidebook, but it is also a process. As part of this book, there are a number of resources and links that explain each step. And we don't have the time to go through all of those things today. So when you get the PDF of this presentation, you will find that there are about 10 additional slides with links and information about EPA resources for you to use that are after our final slide today. So don't just look at the slides we already went through. Make sure you look at those resource ones. Next slide, please. So the Revitalization Ready Guide follows 5 key steps, and by working through each of these key steps, you'll be able to identify opportunities and constraints for properties and then evaluate them to determine various reuse options. It's very rare that there's just a single reuse option that's possible, but the nice thing about the opportunities and constraints is it helps you to an extent identify pros and cons. Next. The Revitalization Ready Guide also includes a companion workbook, which is an Excel spreadsheet and workbook that allows you to collect data, enter it into this spreadsheet as a way to compile it, organize it, and manage it in a way that you can then evaluate it. And there'll be a lot of information that's really helpful in this spreadsheet because it triggers you to ask questions that you may not have thought about on each site. And also it's a way to point you to the information and records you need to be looking for. So the Revitalization Ready process, as I mentioned, was 5 steps. They are understanding needs, and that's something we spent time with you understanding the needs of your community and also with all the stakeholders that we interviewed. It's also doing the site inventory. What are the projects and properties that are of concern? This is the bulk of the work that we've been doing for you as part of this prioritization. Then it's collecting information, including the market study and environmental information, and some of those questions that Dale and Juliet reached out and asked you to fill in on the worksheet that Jim put together. From there, it's evaluating all of that information and putting together a reuse plan. This is a step that we're going to do for the properties that you prioritize, but it's a step that you can then do for those that are still on your list that we're actually not going to have the time to do all that work for. And finally, it's putting together a path forward that looks at risk management, investment and funding issues, proper ways to disposition a site based upon environmental conditions. And this is really the portion that makes it different from a regular real estate transaction, because you've got all the risks and environmental issues to contend with being a brownfield. And then obviously we want to make it happen. How do we leverage all this information and attract development to the property? So the first step of understanding community needs and concerns is defining the project area. That's the site inventory. That's what we've been doing. In this case, we looked at multiple sites and prioritized them by looking at all the information and saying these are the most likely to be ready to move forward. It's community engagement, whether it's stakeholder interviews or a more formal stakeholder group. Community needs and concerns assessments, you've done some of that, and then establishing goals. Then step 2 is really your collection of information, doing due diligence, doing your land use assessments, your infrastructure assessments, understanding what other things need to be improved upon or added, or what gaps do you have that make a property revitalization ready. And then that's where the market study, which is kind of my area that I love, comes into play. Third step is evaluating all of this, and we use mapping to do that. It's really understanding what is your development area. And as you'll see when we talk about your properties today, in some cases, it's combining properties. It's taking, 2 or 3 that are available and have opportunities, but we can make it even more valuable by combining them into one larger site. Developing the reuse vision, and then evaluating the risks and liabilities, especially from the environmental perspective and the transactional perspective. Is everything in place? Are there any deed constraints? Are there any liens on the property? Are there anything in the deed language that could trip up this transaction that it would make a developer uneasy? This is the step that you want to be able to resolve all of those challenges. And then obviously it's the market viability and understanding what the market's interest is. Some of the other things that go into the reuse planning step is understanding the economics and financial analysis. And that's where we really have a sources and uses schedule to understand what do you need to do and how are you going to pay for it and what are the various sources. There's a lot of creative different ways to attract funding, and sometimes it's based upon that reuse. If it's solar, if it's renewable energy, you may be eligible for funding that you wouldn't be eligible if it was for housing, and vice versa. So it's really helpful to understand what your reuse vision is when you're looking at funding. And then obviously feasibility, does all this work to be able to not only sell the property, disposition it to a developer in some fashion, but also accomplish the reuse. Step 4, and it's not, we're cautioned when we say steps because it's not necessarily iterative. In some cases, these steps are overlapping as you're gathering information. But step 4 is really defining the path forward, understanding risk management and understanding how will you accomplish this from a brownfields perspective. This is where, again, I said it differs from your typical real estate transaction because you need to look at how to accomplish it and deal with the risks associated with brownfields, and how can you leverage resources to deal with the contamination or any other environmental challenges that we need to manage, as well as the development. Next step, continuing on, it's how to do that site investigation and cleanup. How's it going to be done? And can you do it in concert with the redevelopment so as to save funding? So for instance, if you need to do excavate soil, but you also need to put a foundation in. If you do it at the same time, you may be able to save some significant dollars. And so there's ways, by looking at a comprehensive approach, you can often reduce the overall costs of a project. And finally, how do we go back one real quick, Dale? The disposition process. You've done many of these things as a community, doing an expression of interest or an RFP, but there are ways to do those formal programs and market them, promote them to a broader development community, perhaps using websites, using social media, using other mechanisms to attract developers from a wider range that may actually bring in interest beyond the developers you typically see in your own community. And that may be needed for some of the more challenging properties where contamination is a real issue. Maybe your local developers aren't comfortable or aren't used to doing that. And by looking at a broader disposition process, you can attract other types of developers to the table. Sorry, Neil, great. And then making it happen. The property sale and lease agreement, how's it written? How do you address responsibility for environmental issues? Are you doing it as the community before the property is being made available? Or is it something where it's part of the agreement that the developer that comes into your community makes a commitment to do the cleanup as part of their redevelopment? And that commitment is tied to perhaps their regulatory approvals or zoning approvals, site plan approvals, all of those things, and or they're actually written into the purchase and sale agreement with milestone requirements. So there are ways to structure these deals to ensure that the developer comes in, fulfills the promises that they make to the community. And this guide can really help you understand some of the key things that have been successful in other communities across the country. So we really encourage you to take a look at EPA's Revitalization Ready Guide, and all the resources that I indicated are also in the back of this presentation.
So, Elaine, did you want to take questions now, since you might have to get off a little bit early?
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, so why don't we stop, take a quick break there and see if there are questions on the Ready Guide before we get into the prioritization work that Jim has been doing with Juliet.
And I guess I have a question. Are you, for the town, are you familiar with the Ready Guide process and have you used it? Or is this kind of new way or new information?
We were following a similar process of even before brownfields.
Yeah, I think the difference here is that workbook that really
Right.
helps you organize and almost fill in the blank, and it forces you to look at each one. And with your experience, you probably have done all of this. This is really helpful for communities that have never done this before, quite frankly.
Right.
But you may find that the workbook is really just an additional tool for
No,
you.
I think it's
Yeah.
useful. I mean, I wish I had it back in the day when, I started in the program,
Absolutely.
back over 25 years ago when we were, breaking ground and having one of the first brownfields. But, over the years, I mean, even prior to this, we always did a certain level of environmental due diligence as a community development agency with properties that we owned. But this could be also helpful for the to provide to developers as well that are interested.
Sure.
Right, and we've used a lot of the tools in it, in, let's say, the part 2 of these revitalization grants, to do the RFPs and development agreements, and a lot of the tools within are useful, whether it's through an EPA or BOA project. We've introduced them to towns that they may have old agreements, old formats of things, and so this is helpful for that.
Yeah, and the Ready Guide's actually an evolution of the Prepared Guide, which came out a number of years ago. A lot of that, it was formatted very similar, but the revision to the Prepared Guide or the Ready Guide was really designed, to implement all the lessons learned from implementing the prepared guide.
Yes.
And we,
And
and there's Jim himself.
Yep, I'm here.
And I found, in practical application, it is a good way to kind of keep a library of information. I mean, you
Mhm.
all are veterans, of your town and your respective departments. But at some point, you'll be passing the torch to, the next generation of staff and planners, and who then maintains the historic record of everything that's been done. It's a good way to organize it. You can set up, with links to, shared files and that kind of thing. So that's why, as we were scoping this out, I thought, you all in particular, because you have done so much, and as you're looking forward into new properties, how are you organizing the information going forward for all these new properties so that it's really useful to, so you're not remaking the information and recollecting the information time and time again. So there's really a consistent way of collecting, disseminating, and reviewing the information, because you'll undoubtedly have more sites, not just in Newcastle, but in the town, throughout the town. So we hoped at least, reviewing this would be helpful as part of this process. And we've used the process ourselves now as
Right.
we're looking at your sites to say, okay, what are the real potentials there? And that's a little bit what Jim is going to be talking about next, I think, is how are we going about the process to look at your sites with new eyes to say what should they be prioritizing and focusing on next?
No, I understand.
The Ready Guide also is always amendable. I mean, over through the years, we've seen new market tax credits become a thing, and opportunity zones become a thing. And with each one of those types of programs, there comes agreements, new types of agreements. You have to understand. With new markets, I've worked on a new market project, and I didn't know anything about what a CDE was, which is the Community Development Enterprise. But but they all have their own agreements, and then you have to deal with the banks and so forth. So it evolves completely. Okay, good segue to Jim. I'm glad to see you, Jim. Good to see we got that technology issue resolved. And I'll be following you, and I'll let you take it from here. If there's no, just one more time, any more questions for Elaine?
Nope, good for now.
No,
Okay.
just the comment that maybe we, with the, for the benefit of the folks from EPA, I think we're gonna be issuing our, RFQ for the, for consultants. I think maybe we'll include that in the RFQ, that they, understand it and, they'll use it as a tool.
Excellent idea.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, Mr. Rocco.
I'm on. I'm not sure what happened before, but I apologize if you were getting all sorts of weird interference along that line. Anyway, one thing I will say about the Ready Guide, and it sort of leads into where I'm headed, is one of the real keys and one of the drivers in the Ready Guide is to really start out by having a very good understanding of your sites. And the better you understand the sites, the more successful you will be in moving towards reuse, redevelopment, and those kind of things, particularly when you're trying to bring people into a site to redevelop it. The more you know about the site, the better informed they can be with respect to what the potential transfer issues or risk issues are associated with it. So that's why we tend to harp maybe a lot on things like the site inventory and the reuse assessment on the front end of the process. And as Elaine said, we don't put it out as a stepwise approach, but it is a process that the more you know up front, the better things are as you move through the process. Anyway, with that, we did start, first of all, with this site inventory, and that was the purpose of the spreadsheet in the first place, was really to identify some key information about the site. The one thing we've really tried to do with the Ready Guide is to make a distinction between smaller sites and I'll call it very large brownfield sites, because the approach to those are a little bit different. in how you look at a site and how you deal with the sites, and particularly in your case where you're dealing with multiple sites scattered throughout an area, and having to make decisions on where do I start in all of this. So the first step is really the inventory, and we've done that. You guys have done a great job. I'm going to go through that a little bit because some information applies, some information does not, but it's all there to be collected if needed. And then we use that information for the prioritization and also for the reuse assessment as we move forward. The next thing we're going to look at is prioritization, and I'm going to talk about that for the rest of my time here, and to go through where we see things going. And I will say that what I'm not presenting to you is the answer. What I am presenting to you is an answer based on my inputs, and you may want to look at it a little bit differently. So we'll come back to that. But let me talk a little bit about the prioritization process itself. It's a relatively simple weighting process that we use, where you essentially can identify a series of criteria, assign a value and a weight to those criteria, and sum that to a score. It's not a scoring system in the sense that you're applying a score to a particular site. It's a relative score, one site against the other. So you're essentially comparing and ranking sites against each other based on this criteria that's out there. So we start by determining the criteria. And as you may have noticed, the spreadsheets were set up with headings associated with it. We'd assign weights and values to those, and I'll come back to those for this. We normalize those values so that we can compare apples and oranges, and then ultimately calculate the score. Next slide. So the one thing I'll caution is that the process is not intended to calculate a score for an individual property, or to identify one property over another on an independent basis, two sites, one compared to the other. But it's not intended to be independent of other properties. And also, it's not to determine the type of reuse appropriate for the property. It's really given a particular set of reuse inputs, if you want to think of it that way. It'll rank properties based on that particular use. Next slide. So if you think about this in buying a car, when you go out and buy a car, you have certain preferences with respect to the car. You may have a preference for a price, the fuel mileage, the options that are on there, the color of the car. These are the kind of criteria that you set out when you go out and look at a car. And then within those criteria, you generally have a preference. I'd prefer a car somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000. I don't want anything less than 25 miles to the gallon. I want leather seats, a navigation system, power windows, and I prefer green, but I can go with blue or red. And then you assign an importance, the price being, in this case, the most important. And I'm going to put a weight to it. I'm going to say 40% of my decision is based on that, and so on down the line. So I have my criteria, I have my range of values, I have the weighting associated with each one of those. Next slide. So if we take that criteria and weights and we normalize that, we would say, okay, I'm going to assign a value of 100 if the price is up to 25,000. If it's up to or greater than 25 and up to my top, my 30,000, I'm going to assign a 50, and then I'm going to assign a 0. And we do that for each of these criteria, for fuel mileage, for options, for colors. Next slide. So with that, I go out and I look at my cars. And so for my first option, the price is 23.5. So given my criteria, I would score that 100. I have another vehicle at a price of 28, which would score at 50, and so on down the line. So for each one of these, I would assign a value based on this normalized value I've assigned up here, and then calculate a score. Next slide. So if I calculate that score, if you remember, I'm taking my weight times my normalized value and coming up with a weighted value. And so my weighted value becomes a score of 65 for option 1 and 70 for option 2, which says in this particular case, the car that's the higher value offers you the most with respect to all of your criteria. And so if you were going to buy a car, you would most likely buy the car in option 2 as opposed to option 1, just given the criteria that's there. So with that, as a little background, does that make sense to everybody, first of all? Okay. So we take our inventory, and if you remember, we had broken down the inventory into property information, property status, structure, infrastructure, utilities, environmental status, use restrictions, and zoning. And for each of those, we had a series of factors. We had property information and status information. We had different information about the structure, the infrastructure, the zoning. So what I am suggesting at this point is that for purposes of the prioritization, based on the inventory, we would use the property and information status as a factor. We would use the structure as a factor, the infrastructure, the environmental status, and the zoning. So these are the 5 criteria or factors that we've identified for purposes of ranking. And then within each one of those, I have also selected some sub-factors based on the responses to the, or not responses, but the information presented in the inventory. Now, the reason I've done that is because in some cases, the value that was there, the sub-factor, is really not something that was either easily compared or really had a significant impact on the comparison. For instance, if in the case of utilities, as an example, essentially all of the sites have utilities, the same utilities. There's really not a difference. So from a scoring perspective, it would be the same score for every site. So it really wouldn't have impacted the score. So those were not included. And so what I ended up for property information, I picked the owner type because whether the community owns it or it's a private owner affects your ability to do something on that property. The size of the properties, these properties ranged in size from very small to, I wouldn't say very large, but larger. The assessed value associated with the property, if you have to purchase a property, then that value can be significant. The tax status, if a site's in foreclosure or delinquent, there are opportunities that are different than if you're dealing with a site that's up to date on its taxes. The occupancy of the site, and then also the grouping. And the grouping is essentially a representation as to whether the site on either side of this site is available. And so what we've done in here is sites that were adjacent to each other have been assigned a grouping value associated with them. And then you can see the scores, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but for each one of these, there was a score assigned. So for instance, how you assign these scores really drive things as well. In the case of a tax status, what I assigned a higher score to foreclosure than I did to current. And the reason I did that from a property standpoint, you may have more opportunity to get control of that property than if you have a current owner that's not delinquent. That may not be how you think is the best way to approach it, which is fine. That's why this is designed this way, so that you can assign this as you feel comfortable for that. Same is true when you look at ownership. If it's owned by the municipality, it's assigned a score of 100. You have control of that property. You can pretty much do what you need to. If you don't know, or if it's private ownership, you have less control and has a lower score associated with it. For the structure, you have the structure type and the structure condition are the two key items here. And again, if there's no structure, I've assigned 100 to it. If it's a structure in, in good shape, commercial, so on down the line, I've assigned other scores here. And again, you have the opportunity to modify these as you might see fit. And the same is true with condition. If you had a great looking structure, it's got a high score. If it's a very poor structure, it has a very low score. For infrastructure, in the case of infrastructure, again, all of these sites are generally located in the same area. The access is very similar for all of these sites. So these sub-factors would not have had a significant impact on the scoring. Parking could be an issue, street parking versus on-site parking versus adjacent parking. And again, scoring was set up for each of those. Utilities, I've included here to show that it is a potential criteria, but it's not included, again, as I mentioned earlier, because these are all pretty similar for each of the sites. For the environmental, sort of the key three sub-factors. One is if there is a phase one out there, so we have some idea of what the environmental issues are. If there was information related to building materials, asbestos, lead, those kind of things. And then environmental status, based on the phase one, was additional work done? Is there additional work needed and those kind of things? And again, scores are set up for each of these. And then I think, let's see, no, this isn't last, sorry. Activities and use restrictions. This is most likely not a big issue for these sites, but for big brownfield sites, these can be very significant where you may have land use restrictions, groundwater use restrictions, building construction restrictions. And again, these are in here because they may be of interest for a particular site, but it did not seem to be something appropriate for these groupings of sites, at least given the environmental information we have right at the moment. And then last but not least is zoning. All of these are considered potential factors, but in the case of the evaluation that I'll show you in a few minutes, I've assumed that the evaluation was going to be done with commercial use in mind. So the commercial related activities are more prominent in the evaluation than, for instance, residential may have been as well. So this is what the spreadsheet, the scoring version of the spreadsheet looks like. And I think, Dale, if I take control of the screen, I can share. I want to walk through to the spreadsheet.
Do you know how to take control?
Yeah, I got it, hopefully. So you should be able to see the spreadsheet now?
Yep.
Okay. So if we go back, here's the original spreadsheet, as it was completed. And this includes, Rosalind, your changes as well. But again, you'll see in here, I've highlighted in red the factors that I've selected for purposes of doing the scoring. And you can see it's set up all the way through here. In some cases, the utilities weren't filled out, because we didn't have that information. But again, this spreadsheet is essentially what you've seen and you've worked on. The other part of the spreadsheet are all that scoring that we had. So for each one, and again, I've highlighted in red here the ones that we're using in the scoring, and then you can see the scoring that's set up for each one of these. And again, once we finish here, we'll pass on this completed spreadsheet so that you can go in and play with it, modify it, and hopefully adjust it as you think may be appropriate. So with respect to the scoring for each one of these, there is a calculation in here. Generally, what it's doing is it's looking at if you look at owner type, It's looking at the, oh, gotta find it. Hold on. It's looking at this field. And in this case, it's comparing it to this field. So if it's municipality, it brings back a score of 100. And that's what you'll see here. And so on down the line. We calculate, as I mentioned, remember I said there was factors. So for each factor, there's a weight. So in this case, I've said the property information applies to 25% of the score. For the structures, 20%, the infrastructure is 15%. We're not using the utilities, so we have it at 0. The environmental is 20%, and the activity use is 0, and the allowable use is 0, and that all adds up to 1 or 100. So you can include or exclude one of these major criteria by simply setting the weight to 0. And then within each of these factors, you can set up a weight for each of the factors. So when you look at the calculation, essentially, oops, can't do that. Essentially, what it does is it takes this score times this score and adds it to this score times this score, and so on down the line. And that gives you this total score for the property information. And that's done for each of the major criteria. And then for each one of those scores, we create a score that, again, is essentially this score times that weight, plus each of the others going through. So again, as I've set this up, what this really says is if you look at these four, well, these 3 sites right here, the Prospect Avenue sites, and this one here, these score out the highest as you look at this. I have an error in here. These score out the highest. And actually, we do know that these 4 sites, actually, including this site, are all adjacent to each other. So based on this scoring, the recommendation would be to focus on these sites. And the reason these sites scored out as high is, one is they're owned by the municipality, that they're generally vacant, that they have other parcels that can be combined with them. The structures are either not there or in fairly decent shape, as far as the condition is set on each of those. And then there is parking associated with these, either, they're vacant lots, or right now there is on-site parking. The phase 1s were done. There's information about the regulated community or regulated materials. And then the environmental status is relatively known. And you can see the reason that the one site scored as low as it did was because of the environmental issues on the site. It was probably one of the major issues. And then also, if you look at, I think it was land use. I'm sorry, not land use, but structure condition was the other. With respect to the allowable uses under zoning, you'll see I've excluded residential and senior residential. I've excluded industrial and warehouse from this by assigning a weight of 0 up here. And then said commercial, professional, commercial, retail, put a little bit higher weighting, mixed use a little bit lower, and the potential for hospitality, energy, green space, or government ranked in here. So this score here just gives you the ability to just do an accounting of this. So you can see that, all of these properties also scored very well for the land use zoning. So that's how this works. And as you go through, you can see there's other sites like this one here that scored relatively high. And you can go down, down the list on here. So does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about that?
Yeah, I did have one question under the environmental section. Or restrictions on the use of property. Why is, in this particular instance, it doesn't matter, but it does on Long Island a lot. Why is, floodplain, and wetlands not included?
They can be, if you think they need to be included, I can do that. Generally on smaller properties, floodplains and wetlands are, well, at least in the case of these properties, floodplains and wetlands did not seem to be an issue. For the larger properties, we would definitely have floodplain and wetlands included.
Yeah, because that's a regionally specific issue.
Yeah. Yeah, and I could add those. Is there anything else you think it's missing that should be on there?
I don't think so. Neil, anything that you think that's missing? I mean, the other item would be, yeah. I mean, I was thinking of, historic.
Yeah, that's here.
It is, okay. Because Neil's
Yeah,
a
it's right
historic
here.
guy.
that didn't really factor in, but good point, Rosemary.
No, I'm just thinking if we're
Yeah.
using this tool outside of, actually, one of the properties that we're looking at that you sent me the email on, there is a wetlands issue on.
Okay.
For wetlands,
Well,
yeah.
that's,
Yeah,
yeah, and that's not a problem. I'll add wetlands and floodplains to the
okay.
environmental.
Oh, this is very helpful. Thank you.
Now, like I said, as this is set up now, you can go in and make changes to any of these scores. So, I would encourage you to sort of play around with this. And, because like I said, I wouldn't say I was arbitrary about assigning scores, but you have a better knowledge of the area and the sites, and you may look at it a little bit differently than I did.
Right, like one of the things we'd probably not look at, is assessed value.
Okay.
Because, we had our assessment, system in Nassau is all over the place. And so, it's not, some properties are over-assessed, some properties are under-assessed. It's a matter of whether people, grieve it with the county. And so, that's probably not something that we would factor highly in looking at a property.
So we could,
You'd want a real value or appraised, not assessed value, but appraised value.
Right. Whereas
Yeah.
somebody who's maybe a private purchaser, that would be high, that's a risk for them. But we usually take the property off the tax rolls as soon as we can.
yep.
But
Well, and as
I mean,
just went in and
it's a good
assigned
field to
zero.
have, and you could use it or not use it scoring wise, but
Yep. And
Yeah, a lot of
as I
times you
did-
use the assessed value if you haven't done an appraisal. And I
Mhm.
didn't see appraisals on these properties in the shared file, or maybe we didn't ask for them. But that's, yeah, if you're looking at, public-private partnerships and commercial development of these parcels, not using the affordable housing tax credits and things like that, that's going to be a very significant factor, because who's going to come up with the money for the acquisition? Because some of these you don't own. So we'll talk
Right.
about that a little bit as we get into
Mhm.
the reuse assessment. So some of
Yeah.
those site specific things really do become very important as you're looking at specific site reuse plans. Once you've, selected what the site or sites you really want to work on or focus on and the approaches. So
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we could also, we don't have to call this assessed value. We can just call it value. And you could use, if you want to use appraised value versus assessed value. The other thing, by the way, with respect to assessed value is, because a lot of times it's difficult to compare assessed value or the actual dollar value, because you may have a property worth 50,000 and a property worth $1 million. And when you have that big of a spread in value, it's difficult to make a comparison. So what I've done here is this converts. It converts. Well, it's actually done over here. But what it does is it converts the assessed value to a dollar per acre in this particular case. So it takes the acreage, the size of the property, and basically divides it into the assessed value to come up with a value that's, more comparable.
Right, like a good
between-
example of how all over the map this is if you look at 243 Sheridan, in comparison to 212 Sheridan, they're across the street from each other. And 212 is slightly smaller lot size. 243 was a little cottage, but because 212 had been burned in a fire and 243 had never been grieved, our appraised value was less for 243 Sheridan was less than the assessed value on 243
Right.
Sheridan.
Right.
So it's just an example of a wildly overassessed, property.
Yes. Yeah, I recognize. And so,
Yeah.
I mean, assuming that you have and one of the things we have done, in the past is it could be a combination of assessed value and appraised value. Particularly if you have some knowledge of or some level of comfort for the assessed value versus an appraised value. But this, this could just as easily be the appraised values if you have appraised values for everything on the site, or it could be a combination. Yep.
Thank you.
But no, it's an excellent
Now,
point.
before we leave this, set this off to the side, I just want you to move the spreadsheet back over to the right no, the other way.
Sorry.
Talk a little bit about that land use category. When I went through the spreadsheet and I spent quite a bit of time on this, doing sort of the inputs for the environmental stuff and double checked with the zoning, but I was having not used this particular tool. How do you do the inputs for the land use? What are you looking at? Is it the potential for any? Could we slide it over to the land use? Wasn't that a big orange column?
Yeah, well, this.
I know we're not using it right now, but I'm just curious as to if we were to use it. Yeah.
This
land use
isn't land use.
Right.
Yeah, this is a restriction, and for instance, if you go out and let's say clean up a site under the state cleanup program, and you clean it up to a commercial land use, you're going to have a commercial restriction on that site, or actually a residential restriction on that site. You may also have a groundwater use restriction. You can't use groundwater. There could be a requirement that says if you build a building, you have to put in indoor air mitigation.
Okay.
So the purpose of this would be if you're dealing with sites that have specific restrictions on what you can do with the site.
So it's like the lowest best threshold use, and then the prohibitions to get it to the higher better use.
Yes, exactly. So
okay, all right.
These are just yes, no kind. Is there a restriction or
I
not?
got you. Okay, all right. So yeah, because I was not quite clear on how we're differentiating that from the zoning column, but yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, zoning is from a physical planning permitting process. Can I build a residential home on this piece of property?
Absolutely.
And then the environmental is there an environmental issue that is going to restrict me from using it for residential?
Yeah, and those are existing conditions.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful.
And then this preferred land use, I don't know, Juliet, can you talk to this?
Yeah, the preferred land use was just based on our site tour and the things that we discussed about what the site reuse goals might be for those particular sites. So those are, subject to change, and then those would be further detailed as a part of the site reuse planning. So if mixed use with retail and residential is the preferred land use, then, that can be changed. But that was just to show, okay, what's the preferred land use generally?
Now, is that weighted as well?
That's
No,
not that's in the description of the site. Yeah.
I see. Okay. So, and that's more anecdotal or community input or our knowledge of sort of the context?
It was really initially for us to differentiate because I know you have some sites that are just, intended to be redeveloped as residential under your community development program. So
Uh-huh.
we wanted to make sure that, we also had a way to call those out. Like the Sheridan Street properties pop out, those are residential. Those are not on the Prospect Avenue corridor, for example. So that's a way to differentiate. So if you want to sort, you sort information, neighborhood retail. There was an industrial site, that Main Street site also, that's likely, that would be one, if potentially there's further investigation, there might be a land use restriction on that property because it's historically been an industrial site.
Yeah.
So, and it's in an industrial zone. So, likely, that might in the future have a land use restriction, but that's unknown at
Mhm.
this time. So that's how they all work together.
Great.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Dale, any other maybe questions before we move on to
Well, you
the,
got a bunch of
yeah.
people starting to drop off on the
Yeah.
time, so let's go
Mhm.
back to the PowerPoint, Jim.
Mhm.
And
Or you can take the screen back.
how do I do that?
Just go ahead and share it.
Do I have to pull up? Did you get rid of the PowerPoint before?
No, because it's on your computer.
So Jim, just unshare it and then Dale can share it, I think. Yeah. That's a beautiful site.
Isn't it?
That's really
I gotta bring it back then. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
So yeah, while Dale's pulling that up, the next just a couple slides we're going to talk about, and hopefully everybody can stay past the 1 hour mark. We're going to talk a little bit about then how this all comes together in the final task of this technical assistance project,
Mhm.
because under our scope, what we committed to doing was working with you to pick a site that we would then focus on completing a site reuse assessment for. So it really takes all that criteria, puts it all together in one place, and looks at the potential, what are the next steps for site reuse. So we're going to talk a little bit about that next. And I think it's slide, you want to advance it to slide 35, I think, Dale.
Yeah.
It's way at the back.
Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. My carpal tunnel is kicking in here after the hand surgery.
You
right
can
now.
send me the bill later, Dale.
Yeah. Okay, we're getting there. I should have kept it on the other view.
That's
Almost,
okay.
almost.
Okay, so we've been
There
through
we
the
go.
list,
Woo.
and now what's the next step? So in our scope, as we said, we are planning to do a site reuse assessment for one prioritized site. So what is the purpose of the reuse assessment? So what we want to do is we want to pull together in one place and visually reflect, everything that we've talked about for each of these, for one priority site. What did the stakeholders say? What does the market data say? What are the environmental considerations and implications for that particular site? What did we uncover? And then work with you all to say, okay, like you've indicated, what do we want? What do we really like to see on this site? We know that, you're pursuing these residential projects. These are intended to be primarily commercial projects, but commercial like what? What would you like to see? So that's where we have to work with you to really refine that and get it on the page so that as you're pursuing grants or developers or regulatory relief or marketing programs for these sites, it's very clear what you're seeking to do on the site. So typical components that we put in the site reuse assessment is, we want to define those site reuse goals. We're going to pull together, all the different threads of the research that we've already collected. The property description, what's going on the site, what was it used for in the past, why is it a brownfield, what are some of the restraints, how do you get to the property, what are the surrounding land uses, is this one or multiple properties that we're looking at, what is the zoning involved, Your zoning, looking at your zoning is very, in this particular site is very flexible. So you have a lot of good stuff in there. So that'll all be pulled in. Um, we're going to be pulling from the market assessment. What are the development opportunities in the likely reuse scenarios? Dale has the feedback from the stakeholder interviews. Do we need a healthcare facility? Do you need more retail, commercial, restaurant space for your small businesses down there? What other demands in the market are dictating what could be possible or likely to be developed. Where are the funding sources coming from? If you want to build, if somebody wants to build an 8-story residential tower, well, that's not likely because that's not going to fit within your zoning. But, neighborhood, commercial, retail with some mixed use on a number of these sites looks very feasible. But how do you make that happen? Who are the players? Is there any cleanup involved? What are the costs of that? Where do you go for funding? How does that time out? So all that is really part of the market assessment. And then, if the information is available and we select, a site that really, has more information, other things that we can put in the reuse assessment is specifically who would be involved. Does the site need acquisition? Is there a developer partner? Is the owner interested? Would you need to, do an RFP? What kind of resources can you tap into for this site? What incentives are available? What do you specifically need to do as the next step? So that's a reuse assessment in our mind, something that you could take as an action plan to say, okay, this is the site, this is our number one site, this is what we need to do next, this is the money that we need, here are the people that are going to be involved, and this is what we see, this is our vision for the site. So to me, this is the real, like, you go through the analysis and, we were there in July looking at all these sites. It felt kind of overwhelming, and it might be overwhelming to, developers or prospective developers, but you really can use this process to hone in. This is our number one site. And sometimes you think it's obvious, but it's not. Do you want to put a bullseye on the number one site? And then how does it then, how can it be, how can it be a catalyst to other development also on the Prospect Avenue corridor? What's maybe the easiest site, but also the toughest site that wouldn't just happen by itself, that really needs some intervention from you guys? So, any
I just
questions
want to
about
add
that?
just one,
Mhm.
just want to add one thing to what Juliet is saying. Obviously, we're going to focus on one site in the next webinar, but going forward and using the assessment process, it'd probably be interesting to see how you integrate the goals that came out of the stakeholder interviews, for example. So if a mental health facility within a community health center was a priority, our process will help you to integrate that into the assessment of that a property for that use. So you do have a lot of other uses beyond commercial that have been prevalent in these interviews I've been doing. And it's very consistent no matter who I interview, economists versus recreation people versus healthcare versus mental health care versus business. They all talk about healthcare and wraparound services. So that's it's those things integrated, but this is the tool to do an assessment going forward, in the future.
And if you want to flip to the next site, Dale, so it's really important, I think, then to look at the sites, like what are the sites, because it's you can't really do the reuse analysis and figure out what's going to be there space wise and layout and access and zoning and preferred uses and all that until you pick a site, right? So this is what I started to do, as Jim was putting the prioritization list together, and this is what we're asking you now to do is take a look at the prioritization worksheet and start to look at the numbers, and maybe in a week or so we could get back together and then talk about, okay, what sites are coming to the top, for you. I mean, we talked about the Prospect Avenue sites, the Blue Deli and the adjacent sites. I mean, that seems like, that is the top, that is a doable project, as it appears to be from all the ranking criteria. You own it, it's got vacant land, it's got a kind of an interesting building on it. But then again, there's some, more challenging sites that are more central to that Prospect Avenue corridor. They, that are in tougher shape, that maybe need more assistance. The American Legion sites, the commercial sites, if you really want to focus on the, the restaurant opportunity or small business opportunity for your, in your community. The Ted's Beauty site is now coming to market. The site M that you said you have some stops and starts on. Those are what I'm looking in the worksheet to say, okay, how can we select one with your assistance, and then we'll just start running on the site reuse assessment work. So that's what we're hoping to do then in the next week, is to get back in touch with you, or week, probably before the Christmas holiday, get your input to pick a site. Then we'll do the third webinar. We'll bring all the information together on the site and present it to you for consideration. So that is the game plan.
Yeah, so we will be in touch to set up basically a workshop with you to go over that. And then from there, schedule out something in the first 2 weeks of January. And then in the final report, which will be in February, will be obviously the accumulation of all of this stuff, but also other reports, such as a narrative plus all the minutes of the stakeholder interviews, which are in the shared drive now. I do them as soon as I do the interviews because I'll remember. But so there'll be lots of other information in the final report. But once this workshop is complete, I'll call it a workshop. Then we'll set up the next webinar, the next and final webinar. So
That
questions,
sounds
more
good.
questions? Yeah.
Sounds very good. That's a lot of useful information. I don't have any questions at the moment. Maybe Joe and Rosemary, but I think it spells out a good course of action. And if we can calendar something before the holiday break, I think we can keep things moving along quite nicely.
And so I guess here's a question back. How long would you like to confer amongst yourselves, or would you like to do that with us as we look at site by site? Or did you want to have some time to talk with yourselves and then get back with us, or do you want to do that jointly?
Let's see, what are we at right now? It's the
7th.
7th. Yeah.
I don't think that's an exhaustive step.
I don't think so. The next piece of it will be. So I don't want to start doing site reuse planning until you guys kind of give us the go ahead and what you think. And you're welcome to share your thoughts now if you have any about where you'd like to work next. But if you want to talk amongst I would recommend probably that you talk amongst yourselves first, and then you can we can just schedule a quick call just to say what your conclusions are.
Yeah,
About
I think that's what we need to do, because,
Yeah.
several of our sites that we're looking at redeveloping are, on the list, and we have to kind of make a decision between the two,
Mhm.
between the sites. The obvious one is 740 and 746, but we also have the site M.
And site
Right.
M, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
so we have to kind of make a decision between the two of them.
Yeah.
And I think we want to talk internally. So could we get back to you next week on this?
Sure.
Okay.
That's fine. You want to set up a quick call, or we'll propose some times? I think we probably only need, half an hour. That would be just to touch base.
Sure.
Maybe the morning of December 15th.
Checking.
Yeah, that should be
Yeah,
okay.
the morning works well.
All right, say 10 a.m.
Okay. If you can send an invite out, that would be great.
Okay.
Is that Eastern or Central?
I'm on
Yeah.
Eastern.
We're all Eastern. Jim,
I think
thought you
we're
were
on.
Central.
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
And in the meantime, Jim will send you this worksheet, so then you guys, can get your hands on it if you don't have it already.
Yeah.
And then we'll go from there. And, you know, the market is the market, but there's some really interesting opportunities there, I think, that came out of the interviews and the market assessment. And Dale and I have already been brainstorming about, ways to do them, ways to do these different types of projects. And I think it's exciting, I think. So it's good timing.
We're gonna
Okay,
send
good.
you a PDF of everything. Elaine, as Elaine said early on, there are many other slides here that are just resource information. So we'll
Okay.
send you a PDF of this thing and a recording of the whole thing, in case you want to
Okay.
get, particularly as it relates to what Jim was presenting, because it really got into the weeds there. And then you'll see other things when you listen to it again that you might want to tweak there. So for example, if you want to integrate healthcare facility into versus commercial or whatever, these are, looking at it again will help you, I think. Okay.
All right,
So-
thank you.
So that's the follow up, excuse me. And then we'll get this right out to you and EPA and of course GDIT.
Okay, that's great. And I know that after I did my review and work on the worksheet and made some changes, I think Rosemary might have as well. Whatever you've consolidated, and if we can get a worksheet sent back to us that's interactive, unlocked,
Yeah,
just to play around a little bit.
I've incorporated both yours and Rosemary's comments in here. The worksheet I'll send back to you, I will add wetlands and floodplain on it, just so it's there. I realize we're not using it right at the moment, but it'll be on there. I'm going to send you a lock spreadsheet, but I will tell you that if you go down to the bottom of to the end of the Dropbox tab, you'll see the code for to unlock it.
Okay.
I like to keep it locked because every so often I do dumb things and delete things. So but if it's there and you need to fix something or change something, but all of the fields that are changeable in there should be unlocked.
Sure. Yeah, I would tend to probably save one locked version and then play around with a more interactive one. But that would be a little more useful than a PDF version, just to
oh no, you need the real thing.
Yeah.
Just let me just share the screen real quick because I'll show you. If you look at this drop down tab list here,
yes,
if you go down, you see that right there.
Okay.
That's the code.
Oh, okay.
Protect the worksheet. So all you do is go into review, and it'll say protect or unprotect. So if we protect it, I'll just protect this one again. So it'll have, when you get in, it'll say unprotect. If you click on that and you type in that code, that VNSP, it'll unprotect the sheet for you.
Okay, that's great. Otherwise, you have to take 10 steps backwards to repopulate a brand new spreadsheet, and we've put so much information in that just for playing around with it a little bit.
Yep. So there's a code if you need it.
Excellent. No, good stuff. That's really helpful. Okay, so I've got the 15th at 10 a.m. down. And we'll have to get back to you before that and give you a little bit of a heads up with the direction that we're going, and then we'll flush it through on the call on the 15th.
Do we have to loop in any of the recent finding that we just, that we gathered during the Restore grant?
Most of that, I think, Joe, I I added into the spreadsheet when I sent the comments back.
Cool.
I may have missed one or two things, but I think the only thing that we received since then was it was the building inspection report for 212 Sheridan. Yeah, that just came in yesterday.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'll send that over to CDA later today. Okay.
All right, thank you.